In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the flow of energy through organisms in an ecosystem. Now, we've already talked a little bit about things moving through the ecosystems. We've talked about the carbon cycle and that carbon atoms are moved from one form to the other as carbon atoms are moved from the atmosphere to the water, from the atmosphere into plants, from plants to animals, etc. Now, we're going to be looking at lots of diagrams today that have the movement of arrows. I want to make sure you understand what those arrows mean. So if you're looking at the carbon cycle, to review, these arrows mean the movement of carbon atoms. So animals release those carbon atoms from their organic molecules when they make ATP through respiration. Those carbon atoms move into the atmosphere. Okay. Plants do in photosynthesis, they're going to pull those carbon atoms as CO2 out of the atmosphere. So arrows on the carbon cycle means the flow of carbon. Now, let's take a look at a couple other cycles here. You don't need to know the specific processes of the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle, but I just need you to understand that whenever we see the nitrogen cycle, those arrows mean the flow of nitrogen. A couple things I want to point out is we talked about that CO2 gets pulled into the leaves of plants. And again, that's where they get their carbon atoms to make their proteins, carbs, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now, the nitrogen and the phosphorus is not going to come from the air. Whenever plants obtain nitrogen, they do so through their roots, and the nitrogen sources that they're using are in the ground. We're going to be talking about decomposers today, and sometimes they get a bad rap. So we're talking about bacteria and fungi, but they are critical to the movement of resources throughout ecosystems. In the nitrogen cycle, there would be no nitrogen available to any plant or any animal to make their nucleic acids and their proteins if it wasn't for bacteria in the soil that can do this. They can take nitrogen atoms, so that's N2, out of the atmosphere, and they can turn it into a usable form. And you don't have to have this memorized, but I'm just showing you that whenever we have nitrogen in the atmosphere as N2, plants can't use that. They can't take in nitrogen and then actually use it to build their molecules. The form of nitrogen they can take up has to look like this. So we rely on bacteria to take the nitrogen and turn it into a usable form that plants can take up, and then we can get nitrogen atoms when we consume those nitrogen containing molecules in our food. Again, in the nitrogen cycle, those arrows mean the flow of nitrogen atoms. In the phosphorus cycle, and again, plants need phosphorus so that they can make their nucleic acids. You can see that right here. Notice that there's no arrows showing phosphorus coming out of the atmosphere. Phosphorus is in the ground, it's in the water, it's in rocks. These arrows mean the flow of phosphorus atoms, not nitrogen or carbon. And you can see that plants are going to get phosphorus through their roots, not through their leaves. The only element taken in through leaves is CO2. Once again, we rely on decomposers, bacteria and fungi, to take phosphorus and put it in a form that plants can use. I'm just going to put PO4 here because that is a form of phosphorus that a plant can take up into their roots. Okay? Since we've been mentioning decomposers here and how they relate to these cycles, it's important to note that decomposers like bacteria and fungi, they are very important to ecosystems because they recycle nutrients. And what we mean by that is they can take the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and nitrogen that is in our plants and animals. So I'm just going to put, here's the elements that are tied up in those molecules and organisms. And they can, when they consume or eat these dead organisms, they're going to take these atoms and put them in a usable form. So these recyclers, these decomposers, like the bacteria and the fungi, they're going to take these molecules from plants and animals, their waste, and after they die, and they're going to turn them into usable forms. So they're going to release the carbon atoms from what they're eating. Oops, I wrote that wrong. Let's try that again. They're going to release the carbon atoms for what they are eating into the atmosphere for plants to take in. And they also are going to put nitrogen and phosphorus in forms that plants can take up through their roots. I wanted to review those cycles real quick because now we're going to be talking about other stuff moving. We're not going to be talking about carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen moving. We're going to be talking about energy movement in an ecosystem. In order for organisms to be able to maintain homeostasis, so that means keep a constant body temperature, blood pressure, etc. In order for organisms to grow and to reproduce, organisms have to have a constant supply of energy. And you know that. Think of how often you need to eat. Now remember, homeostasis is keeping a constant, non changing environment. A constant, non changing environment. Your energy primarily goes to maintaining homeostasis. Because if you aren't, then that could mean death within minutes. Now, if there's extra energy after you are trying to maintain your homeostasis, your heart beating, your blood pressure, regulating pH, water levels, etc., if there's extra energy, then you can allocate it to growth and to reproduction. But basically, those take extra energy. So if you're getting very limited calories, your body will not allow you to reproduce and you will stop growing. If you continue to have an insufficient supply of energy, then you can't even maintain homeostasis, and that will result in death of an organism. Now, we're going to be talking about how organisms get their energy so that they can maintain homeostasis and grow and reproduce. An autotroph is a plant, and they're going to get their energy from the sun. Now, another way that we can say autotroph is a producer. So, producers or autotrophs or plants rely on photosynthesis and light energy to produce their organic molecules. So, they get their free energy from the sun. So, let's add that. Let's add a sun here and show energy is being absorbed by the plant. As for heterotrophs, that's kind of the opposite of an autotroph. An autotroph can make their own food. They can do photosynthesis. And by the way, the prefix auto means self. So they don't rely on anything else as a food source because they can make their own food using CO2, water, and light. Heterotrophs or consumers must eat something to get energy. And they can be divided into different categories. So herbivores will eat plants. Carnivores eat meat. Omnivores eat both. And our scavengers and decomposers eat dead organic molecules from dead organisms. Now, to give you a little bit of a difference between scavengers and decomposers, is a scavenger is anything that has like teeth or a beak and it's going to tear food. So if you think of consuming dead organic material, that would be like a vulture. But even think of anything that'll dig in your trash. So mice are scavengers and they bite their food and they chew it. Same with skunks, raccoons, possums. All of those organisms would be considered scavengers versus decomposers that also are consuming dead organic molecules. Those are like your fungi and your bacteria. And really, one of the biggest differences is these are going to eat, they're going to ingest and digest their food inside, whereas decomposers are external digesters. So, what that means is they release enzymes out of their cells and it breaks down the tissues that of the dead organisms and it liquefies it, and then they just absorb it into their cells. So they're not actually like chewing, eating, ingesting, and digesting. They just secrete digestive enzymes and they liquefy their food source. They break it down. into molecules that are easier to absorb into their cells. Since we're talking about the transfer of energy, we're going to talk about food chains and food webs. One thing I need to point out is on a food chain or food web, make sure your arrows are correct. So if you think about it, the insect's going to eat the plant. So think about the plant is going into the insect's mouth. That's a correct way to draw that arrow. When the shrew eats the insect, think of the insect going into the shrew's mouth, and then the shrew is being eaten by a hawk. In this situation, since this is a food chain, that arrow means the flow of energy, not the flow of carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus. It means the flow of energy. And if you remember, autotrophs and all energy from food chains start with energy from the sun. Now, sometimes I'm going to ask you to analyze a food web or food chain and identify the first level consumer. Another word for first level is primary. You maybe heard of primary school, and that was basically preschool. It's the first school that you ever went to. So primary means first. We can say second level or we can say secondary. The word for third level is tertiary. Okay, so just again, watch out. Sometimes we can say first level or we will say primary, and it means the exact same thing. Secondary and then tertiary. All right, let's relate these to the food chain up here. If I say identify the primary consumer in the food chain, you need to remember that you need to start at the autotroph, at the plants, at the producer, and then work your way following the arrows. So when we look at this food chain, it says identify the first level or the primary consumer. The plant is not a consumer, it's a producer. But the insect is a consumer. It's the first one. So it's going to be considered the primary consumer. And if you keep going, the shrew is the second consumer. So the shrew is the secondary. And then the hawk would be the tertiary. Oops, more right, hawk. Be careful. Sometimes we ask for consumer. And then sometimes we ask you to identify the carnivores, primary carnivore, secondary carnivore, and tertiary. So pay attention to the vocab words being used in the question. Again, we always want to work from the plant and then along the food chain. If I say identify the primary carnivore, a lot of people want to put hawk, but that's not the case. The primary carnivore is, again, the first carnivore in this food chain. So again, the plant is going to be a producer, so it's not a carnivore. The insect is going to be considered an herbivore. And then our carnivores would be, our primary carnivore would be the shrew, and then our secondary carnivore would be the hawk. So primary carnivore is the shrew in this case, and the secondary is the hawk. And there isn't a tertiary carnivore in this food chain. Now, when we take a look at food webs are basically just a bunch of food chains that are all interrelated. So food web is a diagram that shows interrelated food chains. Food webs show that all organisms are interdependent on each other. It shows how they are related and they rely on each other. And even if they're not, two organisms aren't directly attached together by an arrow, if you alter one organism in the food chain, it will have consequences to any other organism. They're all interdependent on one another. So for example, how would the badger be affected if a fungus killed many grasshoppers? So our grasshopper population is going down, right? You can see there's no arrow directly from the grasshopper to the badger, but there is going to be an effect on the badger. If there are less grasshoppers, then that means that there's going to be less of a food source for our cardinals, and our cardinal population is likely to drop. If there's less cardinals, then there's one less food source for the mountain lion. The mountain lion is going to have to rely on other food sources. So the badger population would likely decrease because there's going to be more predation by the mountain lion since they are losing one of their main food sources. Food webs also help to show the complexity of a ecosystem because all of these organisms are interacting, a lot of complex relationships. Another way to say the complexity or indicate how many organisms are in an ecosystem, we use the word biodiversity. Bio means life. So the diverse types of organisms is called the biodiversity. So, biodiversity refers to the number of species that are interacting in a habitat. Now, you're going to see questions: which food web is more stable? And what you should look for is if there is more biodiversity, if there's more complexity, there's a lot of different interactions, then that is going to be more stable. As a reference, when I go back to a food chain up here, if you think about it, if something happened to these insects, this is a very stable situation because now the shrew and the hawk, they do not have any food sources. And so that would eliminate their populations. Down here, if something happened to an insect like the grasshopper, we still have other food sources available to other organisms. So you're not going to see a complete collapse of this food web. So, again, the greater the biodiversity, the more stable an ecosystem. If you think about it, it just offers predators more prey if there's a lot of different prey in an ecosystem. If something happens to one food source, then there's others that they can rely on. Anytime we have extinction of an organism, extinction decreases biodiversity. It makes ecosystems less stable. So that's why it's so important that we try to maintain all the species that we currently have on our planet. Now, if I asked you what organisms would greatly affect this food web, if their population went down, what would have the greatest effect? You would probably say the plants. And that's true. But we also need to mention what is a keystone species. A keystone species is a species that relatively there's not very many of them in an ecosystem, like not compared to all the plants in the ecosystem or insects. There might not be very many of them, but they're so important that if they go extinct, you're going to see a total collapse of an ecosystem. An example would be elephants. There are so many different organisms that rely on the activities of elephants that if elephants go extinct, you'll see that ecosystem collapse. Another example of a keystone species were the wolves that were in Yellowstone. They were being killed because they were attacking cattle. So a lot of the farmers and ranchers were shooting the wolves, and it really decreased their population. Now, you would think that that would help the herbivores like the elks and that their population would go up, but that wasn't the case. When we dropped the wolf population, it actually decreased the elk population, which then also then affect other species. And we almost saw an entire ecosystem collapse in Yellowstone. And it wasn't until they reestablished the wolf population that everything became more balanced again.